Even more than the SNES, the PS1 was practically defined by its selection of quality RPGs. The launch of Final Fantasy VII was a landmark moment in the PlayStation's lifespan, helping to bring mainstream success to the previously niche RPG genre, while also giving the PS1 one of its most important third-party exclusives. But the RPG library on the PS1 is a lot more than just Final Fantasy. Plenty of other all-time great RPG experiences released on the PS1, with many of them standing the test of time as some of the greatest games in the genre, period. And while Square's now legendary 5th generation output makes up many of the greatest and most revered games in the genre, there are several other titles from publishers like Atlus, Enix, Capcom, and more that are equally as important. So with that out of the way, here are 15 of the best RPGs on the PS1. I was a bit of a latecomer to the Breath of Fire series, never playing any of the original SNES entries until Breath of Fire 3 had already released on PS1. But I put in the work to get caught up ahead of the release of Breath of Fire 4, and I'm glad I did, because as the final traditional mainline entry in the series, before the stark deviations of Dragon Quarter and Breath of Fire 6, Breath of Fire 4 has a strong claim to being one of the best games in Capcom's criminally overlooked RPG franchise. While it admittedly carries over a lot of what made Breath of Fire 3 so great, there's something to be said for how the Breath of Fire series plays to its strengths, and Breath of Fire 4's streamlining of the series' mechanics and its excellent visuals cement it as an all-time classic comfort food RPG on the PlayStation. Speaking of RPG comfort food, it's hard to think of a better term to apply to Lunar Silver Star Story. Lunar Silver Star would originally release on the Sega CD before eventually making its way to the Saturn as the remake Lunar Silver Star Story Complete, and PlayStation owners would have to wait another couple years before getting Lunar, meaning the title was almost a decade old by the time we got it in North America. But Lunar's age only seemed to work in its favor, giving the title an undeniable feeling of nostalgia that had already begun to escape most modern RPGs that were increasingly adopting 3D visuals and atypical mechanics. Lunar does away with any notions of modernity, instead delivering a classic, if not fairly by-the-numbers, adventure tale with some fun combat, a great soundtrack, and captivating animated cutscenes, and it's all the better for it. Wild Arms was, for lack of a better term, in a sort of arms race against Final Fantasy VII, with both titles' development being highly publicized ahead of their release, and each title representing the new era of role-playing experiences on the PlayStation. Wild Arms would end up arriving second, just a few months behind Final Fantasy VII, and it still managed to earn considerable critical and commercial success in the wake of Final Fantasy VII's tectonic shift, which says a lot about its quality considering it was able to hold its own against bigger, more established IP. Though its visuals might look a little dated now, Wild Arms is a classic JRPG with some solid combat and excellent setting. Seriously, can we get more Wild West themed RPGs? And some fun dungeon crawling that goes beyond simply navigating corridors and killing enemies. I'm not quite sure why The Legend of Dragoon gets a bad rap from a lot of players, as it pretty much has everything you could possibly want from a JRPG. Sure, the game was unfairly compared to Final Fantasy at the time of its release, and got mostly middling critical review scores, but those of us who actually played the game know it to be one of the PS1's best exclusives, and a certified cult classic within the role-playing genre. While its visuals and presentation leave a bit to be desired in the wake of games like Final Fantasy VIII, which, for my money, has some of the best-looking visuals of any PS1 game, The Legend of Dragoon sticks the landing where it counts most: gameplay. Timing button presses during combat to trigger special moves a la Super Mario RPG is a brilliant way to keep the random encounters more engaging, and the fact that the game swiftly ushers you along its power curve without the need for excessive grinding is one of its high points, even if it does make the endgame a little too easy. Outside RPGs, few other genres had the lion's share of the limelight in the PS1 era quite like survival horror, which, after the release of Resident Evil, became incredibly fertile ground for developers hoping to follow in Capcom's footsteps. Seeing plenty of potential in the idea for a survival horror and RPG hybrid, Square optioned the rights to a popular Japanese horror novel to produce a video game adaptation, and thus, Parasite Eve was born. In practice, Parasite Eve is a unique experience as both an RPG and a survival horror game. Combat uses a blend of real-time tactics and positioning with traditional turn-based commands and abilities, and players can level up both their hero and their firearms, which is something survival horror games wouldn't introduce in earnest until many years later with Resident Evil 4. Ahead of its time, bursting with atmosphere, and a one-of-a-kind experience on the PS1, there's really nothing like Parasite Eve before or since its release, even within its own short-lived franchise. The first Star Ocean game on Super Nintendo, well, technically the Super Famicom, is no slouch, but Tri-Ace went above and beyond for its sequel to deliver a game that transcends its franchise to stand as one of the greatest RPGs ever made. Star Ocean: The Second Story establishes one of the Star Ocean series' signature tropes, that of choosing between two main protagonists and playing the main quest from their varying perspectives, which opens up different story segments, characters to recruit, and conversations between party members that help to flesh out both the heroes and their world. And what a world it is. I can't stress enough how excellent of settings both Expel and Energy Need are, and Star Ocean's top-notch combat, varied character progression, and engaging narrative only serve to support its already fascinating window dressing. A sci-fi RPG for the ages that was only outdone by its recent remake. Tri-Ace's other all-time great RPG is also one of the PS1's best role-playing games, 1999's Valkyrie Profile. Hauntingly beautiful with its visuals and soundtrack, and poignantly poetic with its narrative, RPGs like Valkyrie Profile only come around every so often, and it's easy to see why so many fans of the first game are disappointed with the Valkyrie Profile series' treatment in subsequent years, given how later entries pale to the brilliance of the original game. Valkyrie Profile's real-time combat, in which each party member is assigned to a face button, is a nice change of pace from Tri-Ace's Star Ocean combat model, and it also opens up plenty of strategy in how players sequence and time their attacks to achieve some decimating combos against enemies. And if you take the time to read up on how to unlock its true ending, Valkyrie Profile offers one of the biggest emotional payoffs of any RPG on the PS1. Though Grandia is mostly associated with the Sega Saturn as one of its signature RPGs, it's worth pointing out that the PS1 version is the same excellent game and easily one of the console's greatest role-playing experiences. As a group of friends who discover a shocking truth about their world's origins and its secret history, Grandia sees you setting off on a globe-trotting adventure, all while racing against a corrupt empire that also seeks to uncover the planet's past and control the historical narrative. Essentially, Grandia is kind of like a fantasy JRPG version of Indiana Jones, and if that weren't enough to convince you of its greatness, its excellent combat and unique approach to character progression will. Grandia might not be as well known as several of the other franchises on this list, but it and its sequel are some all-timers among those who have played them. Persona 2: Eternal Punishment is an important title in helping to establish the spin-off series' popularity in the West. While today, the Persona franchise enjoys a well-deserved reputation as one of the best ongoing RPG series, it was far more niche in its early days, and Persona 2: Eternal Punishment helped to endear a lot of goodwill from fans in the lead-up to the release of Persona 3. It wouldn't be until Persona 3 that we would get a lot of the series' signature elements such as the calendar system, but the rumor mechanic in Persona 2 is one of the franchise's best takes on social sim elements impacting gameplay, and the turn-based, dungeon-crawling combat is as great as it always is. For all the love that Final Fantasy VIII got from players and critics upon release, most Final Fantasy fans have kind of soured on the title in subsequent years, resulting in it earning a reputation as one of the series' black sheeps alongside Final Fantasy II. On the other hand, there's also a sizable contingent of series fans who, myself included, consider Final Fantasy VIII to be one of the most mechanically rich and enjoyable games in the franchise, even if its story is a mishmash of some confusing time travel shenanigans. If you know what you're doing, you can exploit the Triple Triad card game, which, coincidentally, is one of the best minigames in any RPG ever, and use it to game the junction system, unlocking characters' ultimate weapons, and becoming incredibly overpowered early on. Paying attention to the game's tutorials and learning the ins and outs of Final Fantasy VIII's progression systems and mechanics pays off dividends, and putting in the time to do so ranks among one of my favorite RPG experiences on the PS1. Konami's Suikoden series is synonymous with the PS1 thanks to its first two entries ranking as some of the greatest and earliest RPGs on the system. Truthfully, it was a toss-up whether to put the original game or Suikoden II on this list of the console's greatest RPGs, but ultimately, Suikoden II wins out for its subtle improvements that go a long way toward making the game more enjoyable from a quality of life standpoint. Traveling the world and recruiting the 108 Stars of Destiny to aid Ryoyu in toppling the dastardly Luca Blight ranks as one of the more timeless main quests in the genre, and Suikoden 2's improved inventory system and large-scale warfare battles, which switch things up from the first game's rock-paper-scissors approach to something more akin to a TRPG, help it eke out a win as both the best Suikoden on the PS1 and perhaps the best Suikoden game, period. Although it's ostensibly just a dungeon crawler at its core, Vagrant Story implements many of the tactical elements from creator Yasumi Matsuno's previous work to elevate it to an experience unlike anything else in the genre, especially on the PS1. Before even diving into the gameplay, it's worth pointing out that Vagrant Story has some of the most impressive visuals and atmosphere of any game in the PS1 library, both of which work overtime to support its excellent story, charged with political intrigue and real-world allegory. While its gameplay does throw a lot of systems at the player at once so as to almost be overwhelming, getting a handle on the incredibly nuanced progression systems and combat tactics allows for an almost unprecedented level of customization in character builds and strategy, to where you'll be eagerly charging headlong into every encounter you can. For the PS1's third and final Final Fantasy game, Square would enlist the help of series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi as lead producer, his first time directly working on a game in the series since serving as Final Fantasy V's director. Together with the game's return to a high fantasy setting and its embracing of the series' past, Final Fantasy IX feels like a homecoming in every sense of the word, bringing together some of Square's best developers to deliver a fitting swan song to the series' PS1 era and a love letter to longtime fans who had grown up with the franchise since its early days. Accordingly, Final Fantasy IX knocks it out of the park on all fronts: presentation, narrative, and gameplay, and it holds a place as many fans' favorite game in the series for good reason. Final Fantasy Tactics is more than one of the best PS1 RPGs. It's one of the best games in the PS1 library as a whole, and one of the best games of all time, with its greatness boiling down to a few key criteria. 1. The game's visual aesthetic, which mixes iconic 2D character sprites over 3D backgrounds, has allowed the game to age much more gracefully than many of its competitors. 2. Final Fantasy Tactics' story is an all-timer that delves into some truly dark and intriguing territory, all while establishing the Ivalice Alliance continuity of the Final Fantasy shared universe. 3rd, and finally, Final Fantasy Tactics gameplay is a perfect introduction to turn-based tactics and the TRPG genre. It quickly acclimates players to the genre's conventions with a sort of trial by fire, while guiding them along a suitably satisfying power curve, aided by the flexibility afforded by the game's 20 different jobs and near-perfect balance. Now, if only we could get a remaster on PC and modern consoles. One of my personal favorite games of all time, and a title that, when I first played it, helped to broaden my understanding of the world around me in significant and profound ways, Xenogears is one of the most important games to release on the PS1. It began its life as the original version of Final Fantasy VII, but the game's esoteric themes and challenging narrative prompted Square to give creators Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaori Tanaka their own team to develop it as a separate project. Thus, Xenogears was born, allowing the husband and wife duo to shape the game as they saw fit outside the bounds and expectations of the Final Fantasy license. Unfortunately, the game's long development and competition for resources with other Square titles resulted in Xenogears being released in an unfinished state. Much of the planned content for the second disc was either rushed or scrapped entirely. However, even in this incomplete state, Xenogears delivers one of the most compelling RPG experiences ever. The game's blend of turn-based combat and real-time fighting game-style button combos during encounters both on foot and inside of the titular gears makes its combat more engaging than many other contemporaries, and the game's story is one of the most complex and profound narratives in any medium, exploring concepts related to Jungian psychology, Gnosticism, philosophy, and artificial intelligence. Still one of a kind more than a quarter century later, Xenogears is truly one of the best games ever made. The history of Final Fantasy VII's development and Square's shift in loyalty from Nintendo to Sony is the stuff of legend, and it resulted in a suitably legendary game when all was said and done. At the time of its release, Final Fantasy VII served as a bold reinvention of the franchise, and of RPGs in general, trading high fantasy and swords and sorcery for dystopian cyberpunk, anti-capitalist sentiment, and a narrative centered around themes of environmentalism, mental health, and the struggle for identity in a rapidly changing world. It's a surprisingly grown-up narrative that, in a stroke of brilliance, matched the growing existential concerns of the series' aging fanbase, helping many of us ultimately relate to the game's iconic cast of characters and their on-screen struggles. Beyond its unforgettable narrative and cast, though, Final Fantasy VII is also one of the best games in the series just based on its mechanics, the highlight of which is the materia system, pulling the freedom and flexibility of Final Fantasy VI's Espers and Magicite, while also introducing unprecedented levels of customization and stat min-maxing. Not many RPGs on the PS1 can make a claim to being system sellers, but Final Fantasy VII definitely can, and its place as a system exclusive is perhaps one of the main contributing factors to Sony's dominance in the 5th generation console wars. But that's just 15 games of a genre that's incredibly well represented in the PS1's almost 8,000 game library. We're interested in hearing your picks for the best RPGs on the PS1, as well as your thoughts on our selection. Sound off in the comments below with your favorites, and click the link in the description to head on over to cheatcc.com and read the full article. And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the notification bell for more content from Cheat Code Central.